Good morning and welcome to the 19th meeting of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee in 2025. I've received apologies for this meeting from Patrick Harvey and Joe Fitzpatrick, and Sandish Gohani is attending online. The first item on our agenda is for the committee to agree to take items 5 and 6 in private. Are members agreed? The next item on our agenda is to take evidence on the topic of welfare and sustainability in Scottish youth football. This session takes place in the context of the separate complaints made last year by the Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland and the campaign group Real Grassroots to the Competition and Markets Authority concerning human rights implications of SFA and SPFL rules governing young players in Scotland. And I welcome to the committee Nick Hobbs, Head of Advice and Investigation, Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland, Mahesh Madlani, Associate at Gunnar Cook LLP, Alexander Waxman, Partner at Gunnar Cook LLP, and Scott Robertson, Co-founder of Real Grassroots. Yesterday, Gunnar Cook LLP provided the committee with a rules checklist. This sets out the SFA and SPFL rules at issue related to the complaints made by the Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland and Real Grassroots to the Competition and Markets Authority, and this has been published on the committee's web pages. I understand Scott Robertson would like to make a brief opening statement. Mr. Robertson.
That was unexpected. I think
I was actually going to give the opening statement, if that's okay, on behalf of Real Grassroots, as they're outside council.
Yes, that's fine, Mr. Waxman.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you very much. It's been 15 years since the Petitions Committee began looking at the issue of the rules governing youth football. Since then, we've had 40,000 registrations of children going through the system, and during that time, the state of the youth game has continued to worsen. The SFA itself, in a report last year, reported on academies with what it called notable failings, elite clubs that didn't even have a gym, boards that were unwilling to invest in their academies beyond the bare minimum, lack of indoor training facilities, and insufficient coaching staff. Scotland's youth system is falling behind peer countries on virtually every conceivable metric, whether we look at game time that under-21 players are getting, or the values that are attached to them when they eventually turn professional and are transferred. Put simply, the system is not working. None of this is surprising, of course. The rules that we're here to talk about today lock youth players into their CAS clubs, shielding clubs from the competitive pressure to invest in their training facilities and to improve training for youth footballers. It creates incentives for them to hoard players who they don't intend to give a professional contract rather than releasing them, and all of this leads to a situation where talent is being wasted, mothballed and falling out of the system. Now, when the Petitions Committee looked at all of this, it identified what it called significant systemic issues that were undermining children's footballing ambition and which, for the good of the game, had to change. So what has been the response of the SFA and the SPFL? Broken promises and smokescreens. They promised to change the rules to compensation when a player moved between one youth academy to another, which effectively penalised the club that takes them on. That change has not happened. They promised to end a system of unilateral contract extensions which locked players in, but have kept in place rules that have exactly the same effect. And in some instances, they have put out outright falsehoods, claiming, for example, that players do not face any kind of ban in approaching other clubs about the possibility of a transfer, while maintaining those rules in their public rule books in black and white. Now, we noted that when the Petitions Committee looked into this issue, certain members did suggest that the SFA and SPFL had, quote, been perhaps even less than truthful in their engagement with the committee, and we do not believe that that playbook has changed. So why do we care about this issue? It is not purely a matter of the good of Scottish football as a whole. It is not purely a matter of governance. It's not purely a matter of competition law, and it's not even purely a matter of human rights. It is also about the message that we send to young people entering the world of work for the first time. Whether they turn professional or not, I think we can all agree that children who turn up for training week in, week out, day in, day out, for hours after school, balancing it with their academic work and participating in matches at the weekend, have shown themselves to have the grit and energy and mindset to be the entrepreneurs, community leaders and even elected officials of tomorrow. Do we tell them that there is a market where they can ply their trade and develop their talent and take all the opportunities available to them? Or do we tell them that work is run by distant institutions operating a tight cartel who can simply terminate their prospects at will? Now, where do we go from here? I think our experience has been that the SFA and SPFL are not willing to make voluntary changes, and clearly that point has passed. We unfortunately also have a competition regulator that is unwilling to act. But these remarks should not be taken as a counsel of despair. What we're talking about here is 4 simple rule changes to the SFA and SPFL rule books that we believe would largely solve the issue. And we believe that with the right political impetus, this can be done. And that's why we're particularly grateful to have the opportunity to come and speak with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Waxman. We'll move straight to questions. And Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Thank you for that opening statement. It kind of lays out what's happened. And actually, I was quite surprised to read about the petition being lodged in 2010. I'm not sure if, Dave Torrance, were you on the committee at that time? Because I know you're a petitions committee member. But I'm interested to hear about, well, obviously, you know, the language of tight cartel and terminating contracts at will. I suppose my opening question is, maybe if you can give us an overview of the provisions of UK competition law that you believe the SFA and the SPFL have violated.
Of course. So, under UK competition law, in the Competition Act, Section 2 sets out a prohibition on an agreement between undertakings which has the object or effect of restricting, distorting or preventing competition, provided it has an effect on markets in the UK. That's then subject to an exemption under Section 9, where an agreement contributes to the production or distribution of goods or economic value that delivers a fair share of consumers and is necessary and proportionate to achieve those ends. The classic case, all of that is a lot of technical legal language, but the classic case of what we're talking about is agreements between operations or businesses or institutions that should be competing with each other, but instead agree to cooperate. So one of the examples that has come to the fore in recent years is agreements between organisations about recruitment, what are called no-poach cartels. So rather than competing for the supply of labour, they agree that they will not compete for particular workers or that they will put in place arrangements that soften that competition. There were fines handed out only a couple of weeks ago by the Competition Markets Authority to a series of broadcasters for doing exactly that, with independent contractors who do work in televising games. And we say exactly the same principles apply here. The other provision that's relevant are the provisions on abuse of dominance. So in a long series of cases, the European Commission and the European courts have held that institutions that have the role of regulating and governing sports, whether it's Formula One, whether it's football, whether it's tennis or others, are deemed to be dominant because they set the rules of the game. And if they abuse that dominant position by imposing exploitative terms or by excluding competitive pressure, that is an abuse and unlawful unless it can be justified. But that's an overview, but I'd be happy to answer any further questions.
Okay. So some of the questions, I've got a few here. One of them is about how do the Court of Justice of the European Union rulings apply to youth football compared to professional football?
So I think they apply with equal force. Maybe a good example is the Diarra case, which happened recently, where the rules that were in place put restrictions on professional footballers who were out of contract from moving to another club. So in that case, Lassana Diarra was he was out of contract with his club, wanted to move to a Belgian team. Due to a dispute that he was having with his prior club, he was not given the necessary certification to move to a new club, even though he was out of contract and in principle should have been free to play. What the Court of Justice said is that type of restriction is what they call a by-object restriction. That means it's a restriction that is so obviously harmful to competition that they don't even need to do an analysis of the effects on the market. And the Court of Justice said initially it didn't seem to them prima facie that there was a justification for that rule, but that would ultimately end up going back to the Belgian courts to determine. Now, we would say if that is the case for professional footballers who may have been playing for many years, may have agents representing them, may be very high-earning individuals, if even they are deemed by the Court of Justice to be exploited by these rules, that should surely apply with equal force or even stronger force to children who do not have agents, who are not earning a meaningful salary, and who do not have the same kind of power that high-profile professional players have. So we think those principles map on one-to-one.
Okay. And you talked at the end of your statement about 4 rules that
Yes.
would need to be introduced. Tell us about these
Okay.
new rules and how might they help support youth football in Scotland?
Of course. So the first rule is what we call the no poach rule. And this is a rule that says that an elite caste club cannot hire or cannot take on more than one youth player from another caste club, either in the current season or in the previous season. So if we were to say, for example, that last season Celtic had taken on a youth footballer from the Hibs Youth Academy, the next season they could not take on another one, and in that same season they could not take on more than one. So effectively you're limited to hiring one player from another club every 2 years. So what that means is that rather than the clubs continually competing to attract youth talent, to make their facilities as good as possible, to bring in the best youth players, each club has a certain level of protection where they can say, OK, Celtic or Rangers managed to attract someone from us this year or last year. We're immune from them doing the same again this year. And from the players' perspective, it means one of their friends went to this club last year or this year. That route is now blocked to them. So that's the no poach rule, and that we think is that is the most obvious example of something that breaches competition law. It's really no different to no poach rules that the CMA and the European Commission themselves have challenged in recent cases. The second rule, which reinforces it, is what's called the development contribution. And this says that each time a youth player, and we could be talking about 13-year-olds here, moves from one youth academy to another, the receiving youth academy has to pay a certain amount for them at the time of the transfer. So if we were to take the example of, say, a 15-year-old player who's been at a youth academy for 4 years, if they were to move, the receiving academy, I think, would have to pay them around £20,000. That is fundamentally different to the setup that you have based in the FIFA rules, where FIFA say, yes, the training club should be entitled to compensation, but that happens once the player has turned professional. Because by that point, the player has come good, they're generating value, the clubs that train them should get a share of that value. The rules that the SFA and SPFL have imposed, and it's really an SPFL rule, say that the money has to be paid up front, whether the player turns professional or whether they stop playing within a minute of joining their new club. And most clubs simply will not pay £20,000 for someone who's a total unknown prospect. And so that reinforces the no poach rule in deterring movement. And it's out of line with the way that the FIFA rules are set up. The third rule is what's called no approach. And these are rules that say neither players nor parents can approach a different CAS club about engineering the possibility of a move. So let's say that you've got a player who's currently playing for Celtic, their family are moving to Aberdeen, they want to go and see whether Aberdeen Football Club will be willing to take them into their youth academy. They are not allowed to do that. They can't do it, their parents can't do it, other youth players can't do it on their behalf. And if you can't approach another club about a move, how is a club even going to know that you're looking, and how can you even become available to them? So that is the third rule. And the fourth rule is called a unilateral extension rule. So this has slightly changed in the latest version of the handbook. But what that has previously said is that when you're in the age group 15, so 14 to 15-year-olds, and you're registered with a club, that club can effectively unilaterally extend your registration for 2 more seasons at will. Now, in the latest version of the handbook, that has changed to become a fixed 2-year period of registration. But that still means that at that critical age of 14, 15, 16, you're locked into your current club, even though that's approaching the time when you would normally be looking around for professional contracts, which you can sign at age 16. So those are the 4 rules we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And is there room for better collaboration in order to alter the approach that's currently being taken in terms of these rules? Yeah,
absolutely. I think this is the irony for us, that we've been spending so much time on these rules which are so easily solvable with fairly modest amendments. So on the funding side of things, we think there is a very good way to ensure that training clubs get funding, which is they should be entitled to a share of any transfer fees once a player does turn professional, which is the FIFA standard. They should also be entitled to the solidarity contributions, which FIFA support, which says that when a player moves, the 5% of the value goes back to the training club. So we think there's absolutely ways to ensure that training clubs get a return on their investment. We think that the no poach rule, I'm afraid, I think that one simply has to go. That's just a straight out cartel. There's no good that can come of that. But we think in terms of improving the Scottish game overall, absolutely there's room for making sure that the classifications for elite academies, progressive performance academies, that the standards are where they should be. There could be improvements in terms of coaching training. There's all sorts of areas where improvements can be made, and none of those are jeopardised by changing the rules that we say are harmful today.
Okay, thanks. I think that's me. Thank you.
Sandesh Gohani.
Head of Medicine for Queen's Park. Thank you. I'd like to start by asking what the Scottish Youth FA are doing and saying in this space.
Hi, committee. Good morning, and thanks for having me here this morning. I suppose I better declare an interest as well. Myself and Willie Smith established the Real Grassroots campaign back in 2010. And only very recently I've become the chairman to the board of the Scottish Youth FA, as well as being the president at Musselburgh Windsor, a local club not far from here. The Scottish Youth FA have done very little prior to me coming into post, quite frankly. I've come in to the Scottish Youth FA just after Willie and I engaged the services of Mahesh and Alex from Gunnar Cook. So the Scottish Youth FA aren't the ones pushing this, Sandesh. It's really Real Grassroots. I'm sure you can appreciate it's probably a difficult dynamic if I'm sitting at Hampden. It has been brought to my attention by the SFA that perhaps being the chair of the SYFA is a conflict, given my campaign against them, as it were. So I'm mindful to try and keep the two a little bit separate, and that's why I'm here today under the banner of the Real Grassroots.
I suppose we've heard quite eloquently the reasons and the law that is being breached. Now, look, I'm a fan of Arsenal, and I've seen two youth players come through and play for the first team, and I've seen two youth players get poached by Manchester United for next to nothing, despite all the money that has gone in training these two young professional footballers. So what's the balance here?
I think the balance is the system that FIFA supports, which is if you have trained a youth player and they go off and become professional with another team, the team that trained them or that did part of their training should be paid training compensation, and that's in the FIFA rules today. You could debate whether the amount should be higher. We don't take a particular view on that, but that is one way of compensating training teams. And the second one, as I mentioned, is the solidarity contribution, where any time that player then gets transferred onwards, again, the training club gets 5% of the value of the transfer. So it may take some time to see a return on investment, but that return should be there. And we say that the model that FIFA has set out, and which the SPFL seem reluctant to follow, is the right one and does strike that balance. But I think we have heard this argument a number of times that says, well, what's the incentive to invest in training players if we can't get these development contributions, if we can't charge a fee as soon as they move? Well, I think the SFA's own report suggests that the current system is not incentivising investment because of the dire state of CAS academies, including even elite academies, which the SFA themselves recognised as a failing only last year.
And my final question before I come back later on in section 6. I'm hearing about the non-poaching rule. How do we stop the big clubs taking the best players from around the country? And I hear you with the idea of making improvements to training academies and making things as good as possible for our children. Let's be honest, they're children, to give them the best opportunity. But what's to stop the big clubs coming in and poaching players and sitting them on their bench and saying, well, we're massive. You want to play for us. You don't want to play for a lower league team because we're so big, but you're going to sit and ride our bench.
I mean, I suppose the first point is that they can only take so many. There is a cap on the number of players that each club can have, so they're only going to go after the best ones, or especially at a youth level, the ones that can actually travel. If you have a brilliant player 4 hours away, they're not going to come after school for 4 hours to train for 5 minutes and then drive 4 hours back. And then I think the second point, speaks to, what I'd call the fan experience and the right sort of to be able to tell players what to do. At the end of the day, if this weren't football, if this were medicine, you wouldn't be able to tell a doctor that they can't move. They're entitled to move their services where they feel like. The hospital can't ask for a fee. They can't stop you going. They can't mothball you. I mean, as a lawyer, if I wanted to leave my firm, I can go. I hand my notice in. I'm sure that's the case for almost every industry in this country. Why should it be different here? And if it should be different for adult footballers, that's fine. But why does it apply to 13-year-olds? They are on 1-year registration forms, which, quite frankly, are contracts, but that was a contentious topic in the Public Petitions Committee. If it only lasts 1 year, why then the following year should anyone be entitled to a fee for them? There's no reason that should be given. They should be able to go wherever they need to go, and often they move because their family moved. So why are we killing the career of a young person because we need a few £1,000s for a football club that isn't going to invest in a failing market?
I think one other point to add is, again, we've heard this argument from the SFA and SPFL saying there are additional obligations imposed on big clubs because they have the elite academies, and so this is trying to protect the smaller clubs. The irony of that is that actually you may have a smaller club that's perhaps not in the Premier League, but which invests in its youth academy as a competitive strategy, right, to bring the best players through and either to earn money from them when they turn professional and go elsewhere, or to generate players for the first team. But precisely because they'd create a great academy and get classified as elite, they are then subject to the same restrictions as the biggest clubs, but not the smallest ones. So to give an example, Hamilton Academical, they are not one of the biggest clubs in Scotland, but they have one of the academies that's classified as elite and are therefore subject to all the various rules and regulations that clubs with elite academies have imposed on them. So they're effectively being regulated under the current rules as though they were a big club, even though they're not. So if the objective of these rules is to protect smaller clubs, again, they're not designed in a way that achieves that.
Thank you.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning to the panel. I should declare I was part of the Petitions Committee in the last term, where I didn't go on particularly well with the SFA and the SPFL. I should also declare that I have a couple of grandsons that are in the academy, one of whom has moved from a smaller club to a bigger club. And I have to say, Mr. Wexman, I don't recognise some of the ways in which you are painting this picture, because I don't think it's as bad as it. Certainly, it's got a lot better than it was then, and it's not as bad as you're seeing it is just now. One of the issues I have here is you talked about a player moving from Celtic to Hibs. Therefore, they couldn't move another player the next year or the same year. That's restriction of trade. Why on earth would you not allow a player to move if they wanted to move? You don't need to, sorry, you don't need to press your button. I keep saying you. That might go with. I'll sort it out for you.
But that's exactly our argument. Our argument is that they should be allowed to move. You're right. It's a restriction of competition. It's what before the Competition Act was called a restraint of trade. It's a clear violation of competition law. It's a no-poach agreement between two institutions to stop youth players moving between them. If this was any other industry, we would immediately identify it as a cartel. But for some reason, the SFA and SPFL do not seem to believe that the same rules apply in youth football. But that has no basis in law. It has no basis in reality. So exactly what you're saying, that restriction is exactly what we're saying should not be in the rules, even though it is today. And I understand that you may say the experience, and I'm glad that the experience of your grandchildren is not the experience I've been setting out today. But we have also spoken to youth footballers, to parents, to coaches of boys' clubs who have seen this exact pattern, where, to give one example, a family were the family were thinking about moving. They told their current club, look, they were thinking about the young player moving to another club, and they were keeping their options open. And their current club told them, well, you're not, because there's a fee to be paid. And by the way, in the meantime, you're not getting game time. And we're sat on the sidelines. And under the current rules, there's absolutely nothing that can be done about it. So I'm glad that the experience is not universal, but it is still live and it exists today. And again, we have heard various suggestions to say, well, the rules are on the books, but they're not necessarily enforced, and maybe people don't think about them. The penalty that a player at an SPFL youth academy today is potentially liable for, if they even speak to another club, is up to £10,000. Many people will not take that risk, even if it's not enforced 100% of the time.
But if they're breaking the law, as you suggest, why hasn't this been taken to court?
So competition litigation is very expensive, as I'm sure you'll appreciate. You're talking about hundreds of thousands or even millions of pounds. And not in Scottish youth football, it's not. Even for smaller cases under the CAT's fast-track process, competition litigation does cost that, because you have to have economic experts, you have to have barristers who do not come cheap, and ultimately you have to have someone who's willing to foot the bill for litigation.
It's employment law.
Well, it's not. It's competition law. It would be an employment law issue if what we were purely discussing here was, say, for example, unfair dismissal, something like that. A restriction that is agreed between two employers is not the same as a restriction that's agreed between one employer and the employee. Here, what we're talking about is an agreement between two separate clubs. That is a cartel. That's a matter of competition law, and that takes a lot of money. We did, as you know, go to the Competition and Markets Authority and file a complaint with them. Their response was not to cast doubt on any of the complaints substantively that we were making, but to say that as a matter of prioritisation, this was not a case that they had the resource to take on, partly because they themselves believed that it would be too resource intensive.
Okay.
Sorry, can I just add? I'm going to add a couple of stats about transfers, and then I'm going to talk about exactly what the CMA have said about this. So, elite clubs can have 105 players in their academy. And once we add up what each club is allowed, we come to a figure of about 2,856 players can be in CAS any given season. We were well, it wasn't actually us. The Commissioner's Office was told, and I believe an MSP, Natalie Don MSP, was told in 2022 that there were 645 movements over 3 seasons. That's not 1 season, that's 3. That's effectively 210 a year out of nearly 3,000. And when you crunch that down, that means 7 players per club moved per season. There are 7 age groups. That means 1 player per age group per club moves. That is the no-poach rule. That's what it says. That's the cap. So the cap happens. And the second point about whether or not this is competition or employment law, the Competition and Markets Authority accepted its competition law. They issued letters to the SFA and SPFL that are either advisory or warning letters. On the CMA's own website, they only issue them if there is a concern that there is a breach of competition law in their view. So it's not employment law at all, this. This is fully 100% a competition law issue. We have a competition regulator for it. There's no hiding for the SFA and SPFL on that point, if I'm honest.
But nothing's if it's a breach of competition law, I need to. Sorry, I'm not arguing with you. I just need to understand if there's a breach of competition law, warning letters have been sent out, and they continue to breach competition law. Surely there must be some kind of penalty for that.
This is where the ball is being hidden. And so the CMA wrote back to us and told us, we hear your complaint. We don't have we're not prioritising it primarily because of resource reasons, because we also have to look at reviewing mergers and doing markets work and doing digital regulation and all these things. But don't worry, we've sent a letter to the SFA and SPFL setting out our concerns, and they've written back to us telling us the steps we're going to take. We said, OK, that's very nice, but can we have a copy of that letter, please? And we sent them a request under the Freedom of Information Act, asking to see the letter that was sent out to see what is being done, and asking for the SFA and SPFL's response. The CMA then came back to us and said, we can't give you that under the Freedom of Information Act because it's information that's come to us in an investigation and is therefore exempt, and we're not going to give it to you. Now, we think that is nonsensical. We think if it's a letter that the CMA have generated, that is their material. It's not information that's come to them in an investigation, and they should be disclosing it, and of course we're going to appeal. But that is where there seems to be this outcome where the CMA, the SFA and SPFL are coming to some kind of discussions that we're not privy to, that you're not privy to, that youth footballers are not privy to. And we're being told, don't worry, something will be done behind closed doors, but you're not going to know what it is. Now, we are here because that is deeply unsatisfactory, and we would have thought that SFA and SPFL, as institutions that get a lot of public money, should be more transparent than that. And frankly, we think the CMA's decision not to investigate is wrong. We do not see this as a resource-intensive investigation. We think it's a very open and shut case. We think that it should be prioritised. We understand their view that they might say, well, it's only a relatively small number of kids who are in the system at any one time. But if you look at over the 14 years since the Petitions Committee, this is a hell of a lot of children we are talking about who have been subject to these exploitative contractual conditions. So we think the CMA have got this wrong.
Allegedly.
Well, you might say allegedly at the competition analysis, but the rules are in black and white.
Sorry, I mean, at the end of the day, just for my position is this. I want kids involved in sport as much as I possibly can. My argument in the SFA the last time was I need a pathway for these kids. Wherever they end up, there's a station for them to continue to play football or sport. That's my position here. But what I'm hearing here is allegations that are not substantive.
Well, we've given you a copy of our complaint, which has
it's not substantive. It has to be. That's your opinion. The SFA will come in here and say something completely different. The bottom line is, all I'm interested in is kids being able to play sport and having a good time. That's what I'm interested in.
So we say the rules say one thing. The SFA and SPFL say another. We've given you the rules to look at, and we've shown you exactly the provisions that are there. The SFA and SPFL then write to us and write to the Children's Commissioner saying, no, there isn't a ban on approaching other clubs. Of course, we've never had that. We've gone back to them and said, here it is. This is the clause in your rules that says it. And what's the response? Crickets. So someone here is not telling the truth. We've put the evidence in front of you. I think the inference is pretty clear. And I agree with you. We want as many kids playing in sport as possible. But what we also want is those kids to have a fair chance to succeed without being subject to these restrictions they're publicly available. There's no hiding here. There's no secret. I'm frankly staggered that the SPFL and SFA think that they can get away with trying to tell people that they don't have rules on the books that are there in black and white on their website.
Can I just ask, obviously the English youth football authorities are covered by the same rules as would be in Wales, Northern Ireland. What's the difference between how they treat their young people playing football in comparison to SFA, SYFA? Or is there no difference?
No, it's a really good question. There is a difference. So there are some similarities in the rules. But what the difference is that in the English system, there is a whole infrastructure set up to facilitate transfers between youth academies. So based on public information, they seem to have appointed a global law firm, DLA Piper, to act as a clearinghouse, so that when a youth player wants to move from one academy to another, the request is processed through that law firm. They check that all of the right measures have been put in place, that there's no unlawful bribery or inducements or anything improper like that. And the public reports we have seen suggest that that whole process takes about 25 days. So there's a whole infrastructure built out to specifically enable transfers from one youth academy to a different one. Now, there are fees between the transferring clubs, but the difference is that the fees are set at a level that English clubs can well afford. You know, Premier League, you'll know how much money is generated and how much cash is flowing through that system at any given time. There's no issue with affordability. And Dr. Culhane gave examples of that happening in practice, where youth players move between Arsenal and Manchester United. We've seen examples of 16-year-old players who in England cannot be professional, because they can only be professional when they're 17, unlike Scotland, where it's 16, who move, for example, from Southampton to other clubs. And that system, it enables those transfers to happen, and it enables the training clubs to get compensation for the work that they've put into the players so far.
So there's I guess what I'm hearing here is there's a different structure for some of the issues or some of the points that you feel SFA, SYFA need to address in terms of the rules. Are there rules in the English system that are similar to the Scottish ones in terms of, obviously that's about transfer, but there are lots of other issues in your 4 points that you've raised with the committee.
So I think the one where there's the similarity is the development contribution, so the payment that's made at the time when a player transfers from one academy to another. But the English clubs can well afford that, and there's also this clearinghouse system so that makes sure that transfers can happen. That's the key difference here is, yes, there's a development contribution under both systems, but in Scotland we do not see an infrastructure that's set up to facilitate these transfers. Plus you have rules like the no poach rule that actually set a hard cap on how many players can move.
So they have, down in England, they have that no poach rule, or it's different?
I don't think they do have the no poach rule.
Everything else, I suppose, we haven't checked every country in Europe or in the world, but I suppose we might say it's unique to Scotland for a reason that I'm sure Ian Maxwell would be able to speak to.
I suppose that's the nub of the issue here. Is this a Scottish-only issue, or is this an issue about youth football around?
No, it's a Scottish issue from as much as we can see. And we're limited in that we can only read the rule books and see. And we've been through what was said, all the evidence that was given at the Public Petitions Committee. It would be very helpful to speak to Neil Doncaster, Murdoch McLennan, Ian Maxwell, their in-house lawyers. But I noted in the clerk's brief, they haven't come today. That's pretty consistent with my experience on this file, To
be fair to them, the committee has issued an invitation to them, and we're in negotiations about a date. They're just not here today because it didn't suit their diaries for today, so for balance.
I speculate whether or not that's because myself and Mr Waxman are here, because the minute they received a letter from us, once they sent falsehoods in a letter to the Commissioner's office and then sent it to our client just after Boxing Day without us in copy, completely in breach of their legal officer's professional obligations, knowing that there were legal representatives on the file, we sent a response back saying, you're wrong on these rules, can we have a discussion about it? Ian Maxwell had a meeting arranged with Mr Robertson, found out we might attend over Teams, was put to him up front, ducked the meeting, won't speak to us. Then we received a letter marked private and confidential. We asked them, can that be published? Can that be responded to in an open court? Just ignored us. And that's why, for example, amongst the letters we have given to the committee, you haven't got that one.
Thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. My questions are around children's rights and the complaint system. Nick, and I'll probably come to you first. What engagement have you had with the children and families on the rules underpinning the existing Scottish youth football system?
Sorry, did you say what engagement with?
What engagement have you had with children and their families on the rules underpinning the existing Scottish youth football system?
So our office's engagement in this, as you know, is relatively long-standing. It stems principally from the work that the Public Petitions Committee did, and our engagement with the SFA following on from that was a series of discussions on a round table that took place around Christmas 2020. The information that we've had about the experience of the rules from children, from footballers, has come principally through real grassroots. I know that's also they've been able to identify families to speak to for their legal representatives as well. So we've had some indication from that about how the rules are experienced directly by children and young people. But there's also been a real inconsistency with how those rules are articulated and explained by the SFA. So you'll have heard that kind of one of the points of contention for some of the rules is an assertion by the SFA that they don't exist, when in fact they appear in the rules in black and white. There's another approach that the SFA have taken, which is often to say that, oh, well, it's okay because we don't actually apply them. But then there have been cases where those rules have been applied, and just the fact of the rules being in existence, the fact of them being tied to the contractual terms that children and young people sign up to, means that they exist as a mechanism for conditioning people's approach and people's behaviour, regardless of whether in any individual instance a club chooses to apply them. There's also an inconsistency, I think, in that the SFA have often said, and so those who are members of the Petitions Committee sort of throughout that process will remember this, I'm sure, that these rules are both hardly ever used but also essential to the effective operation of Scottish youth football. Now, those two things cannot both be true. There's a real kind of trying to have your cake and eat it approach that kind of goes on here.
What oversight procedures are there in the academy system to monitor young players' well-being, and are these adequate, and how might they be strengthened or improved? I'm open to anybody, gentlemen.
I mean, I can certainly speak to, I suppose the wellbeing panel that the SFA put in place, ostensibly to deal with issues around youth player registrations. As an overarching point, it's worth noting that the wellbeing panel, when it determines an issue, is required to take account of the child's human rights. But given that the SFA doesn't make public what happens in there, which is quite right, I think, because obviously they are individual issues about individual children, I don't think we're aware even of the number of issues that are raised. So we couldn't, for example, say to you, oh, there were 100 hearings, there was one hearing this year. What I do have is a summary of a call I've had with a parent that had to go through that process, and I've had to anonymise it because, in the parent's words, I am scared that my son's career will be affected by this if it gets out who he is. And this player was 13 at the time. It was at the second rung. It wasn't elite. Wanted to move clubs because they were driving about an hour and a half a day. Parents spoke to the head of academy at that club, said they were exploring options. The son was in the room. They were both immediately told game time is being cut. It's to a 13-year-old, by the way. It's not just to the parent in a back room. Everything becomes very formal. They contact the SFA for help. The SFA's first response about the development contribution is, oh, well, only Celtic and Rangers can pay that, but they don't like to pay it for 13-year-olds, so there's not much we can do here. They prefer to sign older players. The player gets indications that another club might be interested, but they can't contact them because of the no approach rule and the potential for a 4-figure fine on a child, which is quite frankly astonishing. Eventually, they get hold of PFA Scotland. PFA Scotland put them in contact with Real Grassroots. Real Grassroots help them apply to the wellbeing panel. The child has to give witness statements, has to give 2, I believe. The child is then interviewed by the SFA, and the parent's description of it was that it was akin to an interrogation. And then the whole process took so long that it went beyond the end of the current season, at which point back-channeling had to be done to allow the player to move, even though we didn't have a contract. So in terms of what can be done to replace that system, I think it can be thrown in the bin, and an entirely new system needs to come in, akin to the English system, which resolves disputes in 4 weeks. It has independent parties appointed, paid for by the Premier League in England, so it's not the clubs that have to pay it, it's not the parent. The league that gets all the money pays for that. That law firm interviews the player, the parent, the club, the old club, and everyone involved independently, and make sure that nothing untoward has happened. and it's managed to do all this within days. It's not taking months, it's not taking years in England to sort this out. There's no reason why the SPFL and the SFA can't simply just import that and get on with it. They have a department for this. They have people ostensibly assigned to deal with welfare. Yet the examples we get from parents are that they don't know about it, they're not told about it. They have to hunt through nearly 1,000 pages of rules to find it. And then at the end of it, effectively, it's akin to litigation anyway, which I can appreciate that as a lawyer, we're used to giving evidence, going before decision makers. Are we really expecting 13-year-olds to have to do that?
The Wellbeing Panel, I think, is a really good example of the approach and the attitude that underpins all of this. So this was something we talked to the SFA about when we had the roundtable about 5 years ago. Because on the surface it looks and sounds like a really positive mechanism for facilitating that movement between clubs where necessary. But the question that we asked was, in what circumstances would you envisage that a wellbeing panel, which is required to take account of the child's best interests and human rights, would ever refuse permission for a child to move from one club to the other? When would that happen? Give us an example. And they weren't able to. And what that strongly suggests to me is that the Wellbeing Panel exists not as a mechanism to facilitate that movement for children, but as a procedural obstacle to prevent it from happening. So we know there's been lots of research around children's access to complaints mechanisms, for instance, that flags the issues around the imbalance of power that exists between children and adults, children and organisations. Children will tend not to raise complaints when there are significant administrative processes that they have to go through, when there are barriers that they have to jump over. And Mahesh has just given you an example of how it works in practice. So I think the Wellbeing Panel, in fact, acts to, and it maybe even be designed to, restrict the movements of children between clubs rather than to facilitate it.
Can I just ask, taking the Wellbeing Panel out, there is no other mechanism for, whether it's children, parents, to approach a club, some individual in the club, to look after that children's rights and well-being? They have to go to a Wellbeing Panel.
In terms of the issues that we're talking about, which is about the legal relationship between the child and the club, the ability to move from one club to the other, the Wellbeing Panel is the mechanism. There are obviously, in relation to issues around sort of safeguarding or mental health or education, there are, I believe, kind of wellbeing officers that should exist within each of the clubs that would be expected to take on some of those issues. But that goes a bit beyond the scope of the specific scope of the complaint to the CMA.
On that, the wellbeing officers, how effective is it? The wellbeing officers are in these clubs and academies. The role, how effective are they doing it?
It's not something that we've looked at specifically in that kind of broader context. I think we can say, and maybe kind of Mahesh or Alex or Scott can speak to this, about the extent to which they've been involved in any of the example cases that have been brought to real grassroots. I'm not aware of it having happened. I think often the role may or may not be well resourced. It may or may not be given the kind of priority within the club to really challenge decision making. So yeah, it's not something we've looked at in any depth or detail in that broader sense.
One thing I can say is that I've just brought up the SFA's transition report from May 2024, which is the report where they admitted that they've overseen a failed market because Scotland is behind all of its peers. The word wellbeing doesn't come up once in a 114-page report. They didn't consider it. They purport to have done a wide-scale review of the failings of Scottish youth football, didn't look at wellbeing according to this report.
Just one last question. Just to make sure it's on the record, the Wellbeing Panel, what you're saying, it obstructs, it's there to slow the process down. Should it be got rid of and independence be brought in?
I'll let others answer, as they might be perhaps closer to it.
Yes. Is the short answer. I've attended a wellbeing panel before. I think the story that Mahesh told there, I think I can identify. So I was there, and that was a torturous process. The initial contact with the SFA they said, don't go to the wellbeing panel. They hardly ever meet. You're wasting your time. And the family found it difficult to go through that process and attend at Hampden. In fairness, the young lad was there and equipped himself remarkably well. Very impressive. But he was sitting beside two representatives of the club. And I felt uneasy that this young child was sitting right next to, as close as we're maybe sitting now, to the club that had stopped him playing football, had told him, you'll no longer be the captain, you'll no longer be playing for this squad, we're going to move you into a different squad. So it wasn't a positive experience. And I think with a lot of these things, there is a strong argument to have some independence brought in and look at these things, because I look at it, and we've been here for 15 years now talking about these issues. 15 years. It took 7 of those years just to get the SFA to remove the rule banning children from playing for their school football team. They don't come easily round to anyone else's way of thinking or giving up any control over these young players. Maybe it is time we have some kind of czar or independent regulator that looks at these things and comes to a decision quickly for the benefit of all these young players.
I think what we'd reflect on in terms of our own engagement over the last sort of 6 or 7 years is that the underlying issue here has always been, and still is, the fact that the clubs principally view these children as economic assets or potential economic assets, and want a set of rules and processes in place that allow them to be squeezed, to be monetised. And the SFA has consistently approached this issue and made rules in the interests of the clubs and not in the interests of children and young people.
Can I just come in there in that wellbeing panel? You said a young gentleman equipped himself well, but how many 13-year-olds would be able to equip themselves in that position, the stress that they're put under in this situation? And does it not contradict one another, a wellbeing panel, if their wellbeing has been affected, having to turn up to these hearings?
I totally agree. It was difficult. The family, dad had the care of, I think there was 3 children involved in the family, so it was uncomfortable, that's for sure. And so there was a good bit of support and a lot of talking before we even got to Hampden that evening, and the weeks and days that built up to this, and just the preparation, building up confidence to be able to sit there. And always having that, look, if you're not comfortable, you can get up and leave. Nobody's controlling you here. So he did do well. I was just looking over there was a report that the SFA did, getting it right for every child in Scottish football, and just one of the quotes from a 16 to 18-year-old boy said, bullying culture exists in academy football, but it is ignored as just being the way of football. Players are written off as disposable commodities. And there's a number of quotes contained in that document reflecting on the culture that exists. And without going on, my view is this club academy isn't been a huge success in the 28 years it's been running.
Thank you, Kavina.
Thank you, Kavina. I mean, this is quite hard to listen to. This is children that we're speaking about, so it is really important that we're quite clear. And I wonder if you mind if I come back just to a point that you made, Mahesh. Did you say that a 13-year-old could be fined a 4-figure sum?
Yes, we do have potentially the hard copy, and we can circulate it to the clerk. So the SFA has a document called the Judicial Panel Protocol, which is ostensibly the overarching disciplinary regime for if clubs are misbehaving or players. And there may well be, I'm not suggesting this is here, but drug offences or something like that. It's this wholesale regime to deal with that, and the Wellbeing Panel sits within it. There is a fining guide within it, so that, like, when a decision is made, how much do we fine each club? Thank you. So it's page 130 of that document. Rule 522 refers to Rule 5.2 of Annex 9 of the SFA's registration procedures. That's the no approach rule. Parents and players cannot approach other clubs. It applies to SPFL Premiership players, SPFL Scottish Championship League 1 and 2 players, and other players. So the clubs are elite, effectively. Not all the Premiership clubs are elite and some below are, but as a proxy, the elite ones, maximum is 10,000. The other leagues, so the other versions of CAS, as it were, 5,000 is the maximum. Other players, so players at Mr Robertson's club, ostensibly, because they're not part of CAS, 2,500.
Okay.
And it could apply to them, for example, if they were at a CAS club the previous year. So they could have been at a CAS club, left because they didn't want to stay at their club, couldn't find a new club to take them on because they can't speak to a club. They've said they want to leave, so they're not getting game time. So how is a scout going to watch them play if they're not playing? And no one's prepared to pay the fee, which the SFA has admitted. It's just blatantly admitted no one will pay it. So why is it in the SPFL's rulebook then? So they go back to grassroots football because they still want to stay fit, they still love football. We all want sports participation at whatever level we can get it, but we want it at the best level. But then they're playing again, they might get scouted again. But if they then speak to that club, £2,500 fine. I don't know, certainly, obviously I'm from England, I don't know that I had £2,500 of my parents' money to spend on a fine for breaching a rule I didn't know about. So we could certainly circulate this to the committee afterwards, but it's there.
Yeah, I mean, I would be very interested in this notion that we have a legal relationship with 13-year-olds and under, so anything that you have on that that can help us would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to pick up on what you said, Nick, about wellbeing officers, and we don't really know how many there are. What do they do? Is it like a job on top of another job? Is it 2 hours out of your total 6 hours a day or whatever? And whether there would be a ratio depending on how many kids there are, because it sounds like there's lots of young people there in different academies. So I'm interested, who would do an assessment of wellbeing officers, and what do they do, and how do they support young people? Because as we're hearing, this is quite, you know, Brian's talking about young people having fun playing football, but this is reminding me about the draft in America. You know, I lived in Los Angeles for 14 years and followed American football, but it's like it was all about business, it was all about money, it was commodity. So how do we support the well-being of young people and assess the officers that are supposed to be helping?
I think we're all in agreement that participating in sports or football can be a really important part of realising children's rights. It can be hugely beneficial to their rights to physical health, to mental health, to socialisation, development. It can help them build relationships. It can help them become more resilient. All of that can have kind of broader social benefits as well, beyond the individual. But in order for that to happen, you have to have a kind of rights-respecting structure and model that achieves, you know, what Brian Whittle wants to achieve, which is the children who do want to play football get to play football, and they get to do it in an environment that allows them to really enjoy it. There are obviously long-standing and historic issues related to Scottish football that versions of this committee have looked at in the past, ranging from the issues raised by this petition, things like bullying, the ability to play for your school team while you're also playing for one of the club academies. But at the very extreme end, also, you know, really significant concerns about safeguarding and child protection that have been looked at by this Parliament in the past, and the existence of specific job roles, and I may not have got the job title correct, within each of the clubs is a response, I think, to all of these things. So whether or not we have that structure in place, whether or not those roles are sufficiently well resourced, are sufficiently senior, are sufficiently independent, are sufficiently supported to challenge practice, I don't know that anyone's done an assessment of that. That would be something I think that I think would be really useful for this committee to consider. whether or not there's evidence available from the SFA, whether they've conducted any kind of internal evaluation. I don't know. I think that would be a really useful question to be asking them if and when they appear before the committee in due course.
Okay, and another really quick question. It's for Scott Robertson. You said that kids are they are allowed to play for their school teams now. So is that happening? And why would you want to ban the kids from playing for their own school team?
An excellent question. We asked many times, and I think always the argument was, well, if they get injured playing with their school friends for their school team, they'll not be able to play for the professional club at the weekend or on the Sunday. That was always the kind of stock argument, that in case they got injured. But it just made no sense whatsoever. Kids were growing up, they should play with their friends. There's a tiny percentage that will make it to any kind of professional level. Why should they sacrifice their childhood playing with their friends and the freedom to play schools football, enjoy it? Having been involved in schools football, it's a different environment altogether. Kids are free to try skills and tricks that they might otherwise not be allowed to do in that more formal professional environment. Why would you not let kids? So it is, I do hear stories that the club academy coaches will say, if you're playing for your school, you might not play for us at the weekend. So there can be that pressure, that imbalance of power, and the kind of pressure put on kids not to play. I must have a conversation and catch up with colleagues at the schools, FA.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Elena Whittam.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to the panel. I want to spend a little bit of time in focusing on the youngest players. Right, so I'm thinking about my own son when he was a wee mini kicker, right? I'm going right back to that early age. Now, he decided that he didn't really like football, but some of his friends really did like football, and they went on to play for the youth teams locally down in Ayrshire, where I stay. And so I'm thinking about those kids, and I'm thinking about the fact that some of them are being recruited to development centres as a precursor to the academies from as young as 5. And you can understand how seductive and exciting that would be for a family, for a scout to come down and see their young player and decide that this person is maybe good for their club and they want to sign them up to a development centre. I'm just wondering what the panel think about that practice for those children as young as 5 becoming involved. If it's as you're setting out, that they might end up then in a system whereby that club that's taken them on at 5, 6, something, is signing them up to the CAS programme at 10-ish, and they've not experienced any other ability to play anywhere. They're maybe not playing for their school team or their local team either during that time. It's a very young age, so I'm interested to understand what the panel think about that, and maybe start with yourself, Nick, coming from a Children Commissioner perspective.
Yeah, I think we touched on international comparators earlier on, and over the course of our engagement on this issue, we've done a little bit of work looking at other countries around Europe and seeing kind of what rules and what processes exist there. And I think one of the most interesting ones is Norway. So Norway's got a similar size population to Scotland's, and it's consistently right at the very top of any of those kind of per head adjusted league tables for medals at the Summer Olympics, the Winter Olympics, success in sport. It's a hugely successful sporting nation and very, very good at the moment at developing young footballers. And they do things very, very differently to how we do things in Scotland. So Norway's incorporated the UNCRC significantly before we did in Scotland, but I think it's a really instructive example to look at given where we are in our incorporation journey. And the Norwegian Sports Federation adopted a set of principles about children's rights in sport based on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and really grounded in that idea that sport should be fun. Sport should be enjoyable. When you're a child, sport should be something that you enjoy doing. It should be pleasurable. And the application of those principles to football, they don't have any of the rules that we have. I spoke to the former legal director at the Norwegian Football Association, who was able to confirm that. And they get much more participation in sport from children. They're much more able to try out different sports. They don't get locked into a pathway at a very early age. And so participation in sports for children aged 2 to 15 at least once a week in Norway is 85%. It's about 65-66% in Scotland. So they're significantly better at getting children involved in sport, keeping them involved in sport, and then developing them to a very high and elite standard. And I think that's a really, really useful and instructive example for Scotland to consider.
Thanks very much for that. I'm interested in understanding, perhaps, are you confident that we have enough protections and support for youngsters at that very young age within these development centres? Is their well-being protected and looked after enough or not? I'm interested in understanding that.
I think for me it's back to that question about how the whole process works. So the clubs see this, and they've been very, very open in the meetings we've had. They were very open in the evidence they gave to the petitions committee that fundamentally this is about money. This is about moving children through a system so that at the end of that system you can take a relatively small number of those children and you'll make money out of them somehow, either by bringing them into your first team and therefore saving the money you would spend on transferring a player in. And Alex talked about the SFA's own report, which suggests that actually they're not very good at that, or by getting some sort of fee for them from another Scottish club or maybe from an English club when they're 16 and they move. So it's about seeing them as economic assets, I think, all the way through that process, and I think that starts from the very, very beginning. So that idea of selling the dream of for a very young child of playing for your childhood club or your mum or your dad's kind of childhood club. The way in which the legal relationships are constructed. So they are contracts as a matter of law. The SFA disputed that before the committee. You will not find a lawyer who will come to this committee and say on the record that they're not contracts, because they are contracts, and writing "this is not a contract" on it does not change that. So there's an entire process which is based on putting children into, relatively early on, a very unequal and disadvantageous legal relationship that then allows the club to treat them in a particular way when they start to become more valuable, or when their value becomes clearer. The Centre for Sport and Human Rights a few years ago produced a white paper in which they argued that the involvement of children in elite sport for exactly some of these issues should be considered as labour exploitation in terms of the ILO conventions. And they were identifying issues around the risk of injury that children get from training or training more extensively, the impact on their education. And I've certainly heard, and I believe that some members of the committee may have heard as well, anecdotal concerns about the ways in which the club's impact on children's ability to access education, the impact on their social life and their interaction with peers that comes from a kind of an elevated training threshold, impact on family life. And then when you get to the kind of the later stages, you're into that question about commercial exploitation, or even increasingly, I think nowadays, about monetisation of data. So I've heard concerns expressed about betting companies and data analytics firms having access to personal information of children who are in the kind of youth academy system, and then them taking that and kind of monetising it in ways that children really aren't going to understand or be able to protect themselves against.
Thanks. I also think I would like to explore a little bit around about, I guess, the CAS programme's responsibilities as well to protect children from perhaps over-enthusiastic parental influence in this space, because I guess parents all want the best for their children, but it's very easy, I guess, for not just young people to get excited about the prospects of what might happen for them, but also for their parents. Mm-hmm. So is there a role as well that there has to be an additional layer of safeguarding from the club's perspective in those academy settings for those young people to be alive to the possibility that there might other be pressures from the family being placed on those young people too? Mm.
There's an interesting point, I think, about the registration documents and the contracts that are signed, because the parent signs on the child's behalf. So the two-year registration that I think Alex and Mahesh have both referred to, that you sign when you're kind of roughly sort of 14, 15, your parent signs that on your behalf. And there's an interesting kind of legal complication there, because if you were 16 and you signed a contract with terms that were as disadvantageous as the terms of these registration documents are, you could go to court and the court could set that contract aside under the terms of the Age of Legal Capacity Act. Because it's signed by a parent, you can't do that. And there's a real question, I think, about whether parents really understand the import and the significance of what they're signing, because parents are in many ways, just as open to the seductive promise of, a child signing for your childhood club, maybe turning professional one day, maybe earning significant amounts of money more than your family has historically been able to earn. There are a lot of pressures on parents around this. Those parents will, in the vast majority of cases, not have access to legal advice or representation when they're signing these agreements, and that is a huge issue, I think.
That's been very helpful from the way you've set that out.
Just on the registration point, just on the registration forms, there's one registration form for everyone to sign. They can sign it from when they're 9. It's the same form for when they're 15. It's the same form for when they're 30. Kieran Tierney's just come back to Celtic from Arsenal. He used to be Celtic captain, very, very good Scottish footballer. He signs the same registration form that a 9-year-old is going to sign. So, and that form has changed, and we've provided copies to the committee of various guises of that form. The SFA are expecting 9-year-olds to read the SFA and SPFL's Articles of Association and Memorandums from Companies House, read 1,000 pages of rules, scan a QR code to access it all, don't have to give it to them to read or explain it to them. During the mini-kid sessions, for example, and Celtic run their development programme from 5. Should it be brought up in there? Should they have sessions on these rules? Potentially. And, beyond the 4 people on this panel, perhaps Mr. Smith behind me, has anyone read all of those documents? Mr. Whittle, you say you've got grandchildren that are playing in CAS at the moment. It's not on you to read them, as you're their grandparent, not their parent. Have their parents read it? Have the players read all of those documents? And did you explain it to them? But you have been on the committee, so you would know more than most. Who is explaining this to them? We have some children behind us. I appreciate they've not been called to give evidence, but do they know? Did they know what they were signing up for if they're at a CAS academy? Who explained over 2,000 pages of intensive legal documentation to a 9-year-old and was comfortable with them signing it?
Yeah, and I guess that's where my questions were kind of, designed to provoke that kind of response, because, having looked at, the documents that you sent on, it is rather complicated, and all of us are guilty probably of clicking through things and not reading all of the, never mind Articles of Association, right? We're just not very good at reading everything. So to sign on behalf of a young person at such a young age and get that young person to sign themselves without fully understanding what it could mean for them is a huge issue, I think, in terms of safeguarding and protecting their well-being. I'm interested as well, my final part in this section is understanding what the new player journey is supposed to look like versus the player pathway that was in place before, because the player journey is being badged as something that's about making sure that young people are enjoying the game. They're getting to do it without that extra pressure. It's supposed to be something that's that takes into account some of the things we're talking about. Do you think that that's going to be the case? Is that what it's demonstrating so far, this new player journey? Scott?
No. That word change, I was informed about. I would like to get some kind of formal consultation set up with the SFA, between the SYFA and SFA, before changes are made. So that particular wording change was done, and then we were told about it. There was no collaboration beforehand. Just touching on a couple of your points, if I may, there used to be, when we did the public petition, they changed the registration form. so that the parent and young player had to sign the form in 7 different places to acknowledge they couldn't play schools football, that they were tied in, that they couldn't move clubs. So every line they had to sign. So it was almost, you couldn't miss it. But mysteriously that form that they were required to sign on multiple occasions, so they were aware of the most important rules, that just disappeared without a word to anyone. And I agree with you, kids, because I'm at Musselburgh Windsor, I get emails from clubs all the time asking, can little Freddie come along to our training camp, basically, and it's a big SPFL club, and he's 6 or he's 7. And then, of course, as soon as he comes, he's decked out in gear, there's photographs in front of the press board as if he's on the road to fame and fortune. And so it's very easy to get carried away in that emotion, you know, that sales pitch, if you like. Inevitably, 99% of them are going to be released or asked not to come back, and it's how do we handle that fall from grace. I would never say don't go, because it's more coaching, it's different techniques, so we're quite happy to expose kids to more football, but how we manage that and how it's sold, I think we need to have a good proper rethink on that point.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that for me, I grew up in Canada, and it reflects a lot on the hockey system over in Canada, and it is very seductive for young people to get that kind of recognition at a really young age. But the long-term impact of that is quite significant. And I'm not suggesting for one moment that that should never happen, because it is, you know, we want to recognise where somebody has a talent, we want to nurture it, because we want to get those players across all of our teams, so that we have, you know, and hopefully international teams, so that we've got strong players within Scotland. But I guess, finally, convener, just from my perspective, I think it would have been really good to hear from young people that directly themselves. I know that you're here representing their voices, but I'm glad to see that we've got some in the gallery, and those are really uncomfy benches to sit on. So I'm really amazed that you're not wiggling about more and we're not getting more noise over here, but it would have been fantastic to hear from them.
I hope they're not used to sitting on the bench. Maybe I could just fill that little gap for you by reading again from the Getting It Right for Every Child report. A 12 to 15-year-old boy is quoted as saying, "Academy coaches should rotate round grassroots clubs and share knowledge to coaches from younger age groups than talented, scouted at older age groups, so that kids remain happy and playing at grassroots longer with less pressure until more mature to handle academy level."
Thank you.
Little.
Thank you, convener.
Mine's stuck on.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, convener. I've been listening very intently to your point, Mr. Madlani. Do I know what my grandkids are signed? Very much. I understand completely what they're signed, and I appreciate that I might be in a different situation than most, given that I have been a national coach to youth in my past, but I know very much what they're signed. And I find myself quite frustrated, gentlemen. I'm going to be quite honest with you, because I think the SFA and the SPFL have got you know, things to answer to. But I'm hearing a lot of conflated evidence today that actually I'm actually quite angry about, because I don't think you've put your case across well at all. To bring Norway into it, I think is you know, I'm very well aware of what happens in Norway, and I quote them quite a lot as well about youth, about getting youth into sport, and then to say that they're very successful at international level without going to, you know, you'd have to actually understand why and where they're successful. You cannot, we're not Norway, we're Scotland. And the other thing that gets to me here is, we looked here about England comparatively to Scotland. You can't compare the two, because that's a financial issue. They are miles ahead of us in terms of their ability to throw cash at this problem. We can't have the same solution as them. And I also think it's a FIFA problem as well, and that hasn't been mentioned once in this at all. And I think the one thing that gets to me is the talk about UNCRC and the fact that in this 14 years, this has never managed to be brought forward. There are things to be, there are questions for the SFA and the SPFL to answer here. And this idea that our youth football system is not working, well, I don't see that. What I see is very competitive at younger ages. It falls away at older age groups, which is why the questions I want to talk about are how we transition from youth to adult football. Because 2,700 players in our academies, and 0.7% of them end up in any kind of employment in football. I mean that return is just not good enough. So, can I ask what your views are on the sort of new cooperation system for youth players in the transition phase? How are we transitioning our youth into seniors?
I'll let them speak to that specific question, but just to pick up a couple of the points that you mentioned. On the international comparisons, we're talking about countries where the SFA themselves have drawn those comparisons. We've taken their report. They have drawn comparisons between Scotland and what the SFA say are peer countries based on things like population size. The SFA did the analysis to look at things like how much game time are under-21 players getting, are they successfully adopting a transfer value model, how are the clubs generating revenue. These are the SFA's comparisons. We're not making them up, we're taking their evidence and saying on their evidence Scotland is performing badly against international comparisons, and that is the SFA's own conclusion.
Under 21.
Under 21. But their conclusion was that there are all these series of problems in the youth system in Scotland based on comparisons that they have made with what they think are peer countries. So that's not us saying this is the right comparison, that's them, and we're taking their evidence.
Okay, can I just
saying on their evidence the system is
but their evidence, the evidence that gets to me is one of the reasons that we're so poor is that there's about 2,500 coaches still waiting to get accredited. That's a problem.
Well, I mean, there are reasons for that. One being that the SFA insists on all coaches going through their training programme, even if it's only an hour-long online course where you can watch a movie and get through it. Yeah, I mean, they set a restriction on which programmes coaches can go through. That would be absolutely wonderful if they allowed other providers to come in and get more coaches accredited as well.
Same across all sport, let me tell you. Same across all sport.
That's fine. I'm not making any judgments about other sports as well. But since you raised that point, the SFA themselves impose a restriction as a bottleneck on how many coaches can get through. So that's up to them to solve.
My problem, my issue here is that's a specific problem. If you come here with that specific problem, I would agree with you. And there's other major failings, in my view, on the SFA and the SPFL. But what you haven't presented that today. So I'm asking you the question about the cooperation system.
Okay. Well, I've explained one of the points that you mentioned that you were displeased about. You mentioned England. We were asked a question about England, so we've answered it. And as for FIFA, I'm not sure which specific FIFA problem you're referring to, but FIFA do have a template for how clubs can make a return on their investment for training people. That's there. It's on their books. The SFA, in their correspondence with us and the Children's Commissioner, actually endorsed that model, but then they maintain a completely different one in their rules. So again, it is their evidence.
Have you approached FIFA on that? Because the SFA are members of FIFA. And so they have to adhere to their rules. So have you approached FIFA on that?
The SFA have told us that they adopt the training compensation model that FIFA endorse, and they are silent on the fact that they also have the development contribution system, which FIFA does not endorse.
But have you written to FIFA on that?
Well, we don't need to write to FIFA.
Yes, you do, because the SFA are a member of FIFA. They have to abide by the rules of FIFA. So surely there is an avenue here to...
The FIFA rules do not preclude them legally from having the development contribution. We say competition law precludes it, but the FIFA rules don't preclude it. What we're saying is the FIFA rules, the FIFA model for compensation is a good one, and the SFA seem to endorse it in their writing, but the SPFL maintain an additional separate system which locks players in. So that's the evidence there. But I don't know if others want to speak about the cooperation system for players transitioning to the adult game.
If I could just on that FIFA point, it's obviously, the SFA is a member of FIFA, so it's obviously open to the SFA to approach FIFA if they don't think that the money that clubs are getting through the FIFA model is sufficient. I'm not aware whether they've done that. The Minister has written to FIFA twice, I believe, on this issue. The second letter was not responded to, so she asked them whether, in FIFA's view, it was acceptable to have some of these rules around the length of registration agreements and training compensation. Despite having been chased on a number of occasions, FIFA has not responded to the Minister, and that was 3 years ago, I think, 2-3 years ago.
I might have a go myself. However, SFA and the SPFL have, and evidence have said they have to adhere to the to FIFA rules.
They do, but FIFA rules don't require them to have their own development contribution model.
Okay.
Can I just also add on the point about coaches? I'm glad you've raised it because it's also a competition law issue. We actually have a case in the Competition Appeals Tribunal about education providers not being able to restrict the market to themselves. It was actually to do with law firms. It was a company called Socrates brought a claim against the Law Society of England and Wales over training for solicitors in a certain I think it's something to do with anti-money laundering legislation courses, which we're all required to do. The result was that you can't lock it to yourself. The Law Society, and that's similar to the SFA in this regard, weren't allowed to. They were told by the court, you can't lock it to yourself. So in terms of the issues with coaches, it's a competition issue again. It just happens to have been something that was brought up after we filed our complaint. That's why it's not in it. More than happy to write to you about it if you'd like.
I'm very well aware of it. I mean, as I say, I am still a senior coach and have to renew all the time. And it is very restricted where you can actually get your qualifications from, and that's across the board. Can I ask, again, the cooperation system? I want to go back to the cooperation system that's been brought back. In your opinion, should that model apply to the younger age groups as well?
Is that the one to do with the loans for the 18 to 21-year-olds that's going to be implemented? Well, one, I believe that's only just coming in, so we don't have evidence to speak to. So I'll preface this by saying it's speculation on my part. If not many of the 2,856 maximum number of players in CAS, we don't think it's quite that high based on letters we've seen from the SFA previously. If they're not making it beyond 15 and 16, what does it matter that they're available to go on loan at 18? They're not there anyway, it doesn't matter. And if the point is, and I think the SFA would accept this, by saying that we need to give more game time to our younger players, maybe in lower leagues, to get them ready for first team football, then if game time is the aim, our complaint says that game time is something that would be improved by deleting 4 rules out of a 400-page book. So I think we can all agree that we want more game time for our young players. I think everyone wants that. Coaches, clubs, fans. I'm a football fan. I want to see young players from my club play. It's great. It's great seeing that. But you have to then make sure that the environment is there to let them play. We don't have it here.
Can I ask about the revamped KDM Evolution Trophy? Is that something you would endorse? Would you back that? Is that a way forward?
Pass to you, to Scott.
Just on the cooperation agreement, because I know you'd asked a couple of times, that's not coming in till next season. So it's an interesting development.
Have you been part of that? I mean, have you guys been asked to be part of that?
Not at all. Not at all. It won't involve Scottish Youth FA players. But if it gives young people more opportunity to play, let's see how that works out. But I think it was only voted through last Thursday at the SFA's annual general meeting.
I should just finish by saying that, and I know you said you haven't managed to engage with Mr Maxwell. I think I have, and I have put a lot of these points to him as well, and in the same manner. Just so you know, it's not just you guys I'm angry with. Enough.
Convener, and thanks to members of the panel for attending today. Just want to touch on the wider impact on the Scottish football scene. I think some of these issues have already been narrated, but I just wanted to really get the panel's take on what impact the SFA and SPFL rules have on general clubs' ability to recruit and develop talent.
And I think there's a few points. In terms of recruitment, these rules obviously limit your ability to recruit because they set quite hard restrictions on your ability to recruit players from a different academy. So, if you're a club and you're looking to recruit from an academy down the road where you think there are players who are not getting game time, who you think are talented but are not on the slate for getting a professional contract, you can't approach them and they can't approach you. If you've recruited from that player and from that club in the same season or the past season, you can't do it again. If in some way you engineer a situation where you could recruit them and you could make your interest known, you still have to pay a development contribution, which most clubs and possibly all clubs are not going to pay. And if they're within the 2-year fixed registration period from age group 15 onwards, there's a hard ban on you getting them. So I think the impact on recruitment is very clear. I think particularly if you were a club that was considering a strategy of investing heavily in your academy to try and attract the best players and bring them in, all of these rules would stand in your way, because really you can only attract players who are before the age of 10 and so are not subject to all of these rules, in which case you come back to the issue of recruiting players from sort of 5 years old plus to try and get them in, when it's very difficult to tell what their prospects are. But if you're looking at recruiting players at a later stage who, are not looking like they're going to get a professional contract at their club, or you think their current club has undervalued them, all of these rules stand in your way. So we think it has a strong negative impact on recruitment.
Just also touching on the issue about the caste system and clubs admitting to notable failings within the academy, such as lack of access to training facilities throughout the season or not having a gym which may be used by players despite achieving elite status. To what extent are we undermining potential growth of talent in Scotland through the lack of investment in academies, and what does need to be tackled as a priority?
Yeah, I think it's very severe. And it's severe if you look at the SFA's report. It's severe if you look at previous player testimonies in publications like the Herald, where there was discussion of old-fashioned coaching systems where it was exclusively all about fitness, and the coaches would say, well, if you do all your fitness, then maybe at the end of the session we'll get the balls out of the bag. Would youth players in Brazil really be going through the same system? Probably not. And could that explain the technical gap? What we're not doing today is coming here and trying to give you a list of specifications of exactly how each academy should run. What we're trying to say is if you correct the incentives and you correct the model, and you create a system where actually clubs have to invest and put on great training facilities and give promising players game time in order to keep those players, and they have to compete to do that, then that corrects the incentive, and it will create incentives where clubs really have a strong incentive to develop their players rather than relying on legal formulae and rules that the SFA and SPFL have imposed to be able to just hoard them, regardless of whether they put on a good training experience or not.
What's your actual assessment of the longer-term effects of these current regimes on the competitive position of Scottish football generally? Do you have a longer format or a longer-term perspective on that sort of position? Obviously, Scotland isn't a particularly competitive footballing nation internationally, and there's often theories about why that might be. I wonder if you could develop that point in greater detail.
I suppose I look back, having been involved in the coaching of football since I was 17, so going back almost 40 years. We last went to a World Cup in 1998. We instituted the Pro Youth system in season 96-97. So you can maybe draw your own comparison there. I look at recent results Scotland lost at under-21s 6-1 to Iceland in March. Now, all the kids that were in that blue jersey must have been in Club Academy Scotland programme for 8 to 10 years maybe. And yet we were thrashed by a country that has the population of Fife. So that makes me think it's not the success that it should be, given the money that's invested into it. And I had a letter, or a copy of a letter that the SFA wrote, that annually about £10 million is invested into Club Academy Scotland. It doesn't seem to be bearing the fruit that we were promised. And indeed, just at the tail end of last year, Steve Clarke himself did an article in the Daily Mail. He warned that Scotland will struggle to emulate the achievements of Croatia unless there's a radical rethink on player development. And I think the time feels right, given the legal arguments, the lack of results, the issues that we're seeing in the system. And I would probably broaden it out to the Scottish Youth FA as well, that this country needs to have a real hard look at what we're doing with young football players right across the nation.
I just wonder, on that call for reform, have you benchmarked other regimes, other structures, and what do you think we could emulate that would produce a more successful outcome?
No, I haven't. It's very difficult to get that level of information. I don't have access to Scottish FA systems that would maybe be able to look at a kind of pan-European and do some kind of analysis. I suppose ultimately at the end of the day, I'm a volunteer that thought he was just going to contribute some few hours every week, and it's turned into a lot more. So I don't have the resources or the access to do that kind of comparison. I suppose the nearest thing we have is that transition report that the SFA did themselves, comparing us to other European countries.
But you feel that doesn't sufficiently address the shortcomings of the system, and that we need a more holistic and independent assessment of benchmarking against other nations? I mean, I'm thinking of, say, the Olympics. I know Brian would have more experience of this than me, but Britain didn't perform well in the 90s in the Olympics, and there was a concerted effort to reassess completely how we approached elite talent development through the Olympic programme, and that seemed to produce significant results, culminating in London 2012. I wonder whether there's a similar measure needed in Scotland in regards to football training.
I would absolutely agree with you. Now feels like a pivotal moment for me and where we are with our football, and we need to take that bigger, broader look about how we're developing, how we're keeping kids safe, developing, how we're funding our football as well. So I would absolutely 100% agree with you.
Okay, I think that's me.
And Sandesh Gohani.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener. I suppose I want to go back to the fact that this is children. We are talking about kids as young as 5 and 6 wanting to play a sport that they love. We're all talking about money and incentivization and all these things, but ultimately it comes down to a game of kicking a ball that these children are just in love with. There is a balance, I feel, between having children playing football and being coached and ensuring that clubs and others are able to ensure that their investment is protected. So from a purely child point of view, what do you think is the position that we have at the moment? Not looking at it from a club point of view, not looking at it from a financial point of view, but just children playing football.
Start and then hand over to Nick. I think that the best way to get children playing football and enjoying it is for those kids who are, in the caste system, is relieving them of these rules that when they're not getting game time or when they're not like to turn professional or for whatever reason the club isn't prioritising their individual development, that they should be free to go and play elsewhere. whether that's to play at another elite club, whether it's to play at a club lower down the CAS performance level. I think giving children the freedom that these rules currently restrict would obviously and inherently give them more opportunities to play football elsewhere. And even if they're not going to turn professional, I think giving children and their parents the autonomy to have a go, to see if they can make it. And if they can't, it's not the end of the world, but at least they've succeeded or failed on their own footballing merits, rather than because another institution has told them, you're signed in, you're locked in now. I think that would give children a lot more opportunities simply to play football, which is, of course, what they're there to do. That will require a change of mindset. So we spoke a little bit about the registration form earlier, which asks players and their parents to commit to abide by all rules and regulations of any recognised football authority, which, as we've discussed, entails signing up to thousands of pages of rules, to economic restrictions, to all sorts, which simply shouldn't be part of the game. So I think we have obviously focused on the rules that we think are anti-competitive, but we think there is a broader impact from removing those rules, which is that it would give many of these children more opportunities simply to play, rather than being locked into a club where they're not getting game time. But maybe, Nick, I'll hand over to you to see if there's any other children-specific issues you want to mention.
Except to reiterate the point I made earlier, which is that I think there is agreement from all of us around this table about the positive impact that sport and football can have on the lives of individual children and young people, but also on society more broadly. What that requires in order to achieve it is a rights-respecting model that's embedded throughout sport, including football. And what we're identifying here is a number of aspects in which children's rights are not being prioritised by the football authorities, where the economic interests of clubs are being given precedence, and we're suggesting that has and will continue to have until it's fixed a negative impact on children's ability to play football at the highest level, to garner enjoyment from it, and to be able to exercise and enjoy their rights in the fullest way that we would all want them to.
I mean, I do want to just briefly touch on this contract. Is it right that children are signing contracts at this age? Do we have a contract with schools to say you must abide by all the rules? Your 5-year-old has to sign this before they're allowed into our primary school. And what's the alternative? Okay, I've read all these ideas and contracts that you've given me, and I don't agree with it. So does that mean my child's not allowed to play football now?
Yeah, these are legal agreements which are not open to negotiation. So it's a contract as a matter of law, but it's not a contract that you have as a child any power to negotiate, because it's imposed upon you by the SFA. So I think that is a really important point. Is that's your choice. You can sign it, and you can bind yourself to all these rules and regulations with all the consequences that flow from that, or you cannot. And that it is a really binary choice when that's presented to you.
I want to ask something that might be a little bit controversial, but is this... Our kids aren't being paid to play this game by the clubs that they're with, so are we asking them to sign something akin to slavery?
I'm not sure going quite that far, but it is certainly exploitative. You have children giving up a huge amount of their time, right? So you're talking about training sessions multiple times a week, after school, that they're having to combine with their academic work, probably not getting home until late at night and doing much of their work. We have them putting in effort week in, week out to try and get game time, to perform well for their clubs. They represent clearly a potential financial prospect for the clubs that they're signed to, and as others have alluded to, the prospect of them succeeding in getting a professional contract is necessarily low. Not everyone can become a professional footballer. So I think the fact that we have that backdrop, combined with rules that don't even allow children to maximise their opportunity of succeeding, because they're locked into whichever club they first sign up to. We do think that is extremely exploitative. I'm not going to go so far as to say it's slavery, but it is very exploitative for children who simply want to play football and to succeed or fail on their merits.
So when I was with Queen's Park, we did very well and got promoted from League Two to League One. We won the league, and it was a fantastic day. These are professional footballers. We were amateur at the time, and we basically had a brand new squad at the start of the League One campaign because they didn't have a contract, and they were poached by everyone above and below us. And that was heartbreaking to see, this group of players coming through and not being able to be kept together because there was no contract. If you're a child and you signed a one-year contract, does that not seem to be exactly the same as my players when I was there, ending their contracts and choosing what they do at that point?
That's a fundamental aspect of contract law in the United Kingdom, unless we're about to say that workers shouldn't have contractual rights vis-à-vis their employers. I'm not entirely sure what needs to change about that. At the end of the day, those players presumably had short-term contracts because the club was not prepared to risk carrying the liability of paying money to them in the event that they weren't promoted. I mean, so you can't have your cake and eat it like they do with the unilateral extension, where it's from the player's perspective, it's 1 year, no certainty, no control, but we can renew it if we feel like it whenever we want, imposed by the rules. If it's a professional footballer, I mean, Manchester United famously in England try to insert an additional year option into every contract that they have with a player that lets them renew it in the last year. But that player gets to negotiate their contract. These children don't get anything. And this is the very heart of why we say this is an abuse of a dominant position. This is why it breaches the UK Competition Act. There's no getting around it. It's an unfair trading term imposed on these children with no say. It's not allowed under UK law at all, no exemptions. There's no case law that says that that is permitted in any industry whatsoever. Why should the exemption to that be children in football? It's not even professional footballers themselves, because they have more rights than these children. It is insanity that this has been allowed by the SFA, the SPFL, and quite frankly, the Competition and Markets Authority to persist. It's a failed market, in the words of the SFA that are meant to run it. And the Competition and Markets Authority have said, by issuing that letter, that they are concerned about a breach of competition law. That's it. There's nothing else to that point, if I'm honest.
I'm aware that we're vastly running out of time, so I'll keep my next question short. Football is very tribal. It's probably the most tribal thing that is very popular. If you're a fan of a football club, you think it's brilliant beyond everything else, and you think the other clubs are pretty much rubbish, as I do as well when I'm watching my team play. But this, I think, is the reason why you're having the ability to do what you want, because you're so strongly supported no matter what it is you do by a huge amount of people that will back you because they think you're doing the best for your club. So is there another place across locked in to doing something? Is there anything in society that is similar to what is happening in youth football?
I mean, not to my knowledge. I'm not aware of any market that has these features. I mean, I suppose I should say, in terms of the point about, the support players get, and especially from fans. I'm a Liverpool fan. I appreciate you said you're an Arsenal fan, and maybe that it's not great to hear Liverpool fans speaking, given we won the title. But, no one has experienced that heartbreak more than me, unless there's another Liverpool room in this fan at this moment. Our prized academy player, Trent Alexander-Arnold, He's won everything for us, said he wanted to captain the club. He was at the club since he was 6. He was pictured when we won the Champions League with Steven Gerrard. He's the anointed heir. He left on a free, regardless. And as much as that upsets me as a football fan, as a member of the public, that has to be tolerated in a country like this, because he is employed by that club. He agreed a contract with them. It finished. He should not have been forced, and he wasn't forced, to stay somewhere when he didn't want to be there. Why is he allowed to have that right as an adult with all the advice that he can get from his family, from agents? He's clearly earning millions of pounds, can afford the best advice in the world if he wants it. Why is he allowed to do that, but 13-year-olds in Scotland can't? There's nothing... I don't think there's anything that angers me personally more about this problem than the fact that that can exist. I appreciate that the players get support, but we all get support from the people that employ us. Nowhere else is allowed to do this to their workers. And to touch on the slavery points, and again, I don't at all suggest that this goes as far as slavery, but when I checked last summer when we were considering whether or not to make a complaint, it struck me that at least as late as, let's say, June 2024, the Scottish Football Association doesn't have a modern slavery statement. I'm pretty sure it's required to. The SPFL's one is out of date. So I think if we want some sort of indication as to how much they actually care about this, the fact that they can't even comply with that, I think really speaks volumes. We need to do more to help Scottish children. And the aim isn't to make people more money. I know that at the moment the governments of the day want economic growth, but that's not what this is about. I think everyone in this room wants to see Scotland do well as a country in football tournaments. It wants to see them at a World Cup. It wants to see them go far into a World Cup. Wales got to a semi-final of the Euros in 2016. There's Scotland in the 80s, and again, as a Liverpool fan, maybe I've got a bias. It had some of the best players in the world. Liverpool's best ever striker is Scottish. Sorry. Apologies. Of course, I'm happy for you to.
Sorry, Convener, I can't hear you.
Because these two are on. In the chat.
Are you? Thank you. We will recommence the meeting by thanking the panel for their attendance today and for their evidence. At next week's meeting, we'll take evidence on children and young people's participation in sport and physical activity, and that concludes the public part of our meeting today.